Imagine a city with no families, no private property, and philosopher kings ruling with absolute authority. Sounds like a dystopia? Well, that was Plato's idea of a perfect state from his work called The Republic. How did one of the greatest thinkers in history go from talking about justice to proposing something that looks like Orwell meets ancient Greece? Let's break it down. We'll start by understanding the context in which this work was created. We are in the 4th century BC, right after the end of the Peloponnesian War, a brutal conflict between Athens and Sparta. At the beginning of the war, Athens was at the height of its democratic power, but things went downhill fast. The war itself drained the city both morally and financially. Then came a devastating plague, a wave of revolts from their allies, and to top it all off, a disastrously bad decision. The Sicilian expedition, which ended in total military disaster. Plato belonged to the generation that grew up under a strong democracy, but by the time he was an adult, he witnessed its decline. And it wasn't just about losing a war or seeing the democratic regime fall to the rule of the 30 tyrants. For Plato personally, the biggest failure of Athenian democracy was the execution of Socrates. Socrates didn't have a direct role in the 30 tyrants regime, but some of his students, like Critias and Charmides, were part of that government. So when the tyrants were overthrown and democracy was restored, people turned their anger towards Socrates. That's when his trial began. Our main sources about the trial are Plato himself in his Apology, Xenophon, and somehow Aristophanes' comedy The Clouds, which offers a kind of satirical version of Socrates. But overall, the trial can be seen as a reaction to the political instability of the time. People were suspicious, hurt, and looking for someone to blame. In the end, a public vote sentenced Socrates to death by poison. You can see why Plato, after witnessing the cruelty and injustice under both democratic and oligarchic rule, and feeling deeply disillusioned with Athenian politics, would spend most of his philosophical career trying to figure out what the ideal state should look like. In The Republic, Plato asks two of the biggest questions in political philosophy. What is justice? And how can we govern in a way that doesn't lead to collapse? Instead of building a society based mainly on freedom, he argues that it should be built on wisdom and order. Let's take a closer look at what he means by that. Just like all of Plato's works, The Republic is written as an open dialogue, mostly between Socrates and his students. At first, they try to figure out what justice actually is. The tricky part is this: is justice valuable on its own, or is it just something society tells us is good, so we'll behave? To get a clearer picture of justice, Socrates suggests zooming out. Instead of looking at a single person, why not to look at an entire state? States, after all, can also be just or unjust, and when you examine things on a larger scale, it's easier to spot the details. According to Socrates, people come together to form a state so they can live cooperatively and trade with each other. If you are a skilled farmer, you grow wheat and sell it. If you are a baker, you buy wheat from the farmer and sell bread. Everyone does what they're best at, and society runs more smoothly. Labor is divided, trade begins, and people are generally happy. Young and poor states live simple but healthy lives. Basic food, basic needs, nothing fancy. But Plato says people aren't content with just that. They'll start wanting luxuries, jewelry, furniture, fancy foods, perfumes, entertainment, pastries, and so on. And that, according to Plato, is the turning point. The moment when justice and injustice begin to appear. As the state grows wealthier, it needs more land to feed more people. In ancient Athens, that meant expansion through war. And for war, you need soldiers. Not just citizen militias, but a professional army. Athenian citizens were regular people who would vote on whether to go to war and then grab their weapons and march off themselves. Plato thought this was all wrong. He believed that each person is naturally suited for just one kind of work and they should train for it from birth. So if you're meant to be a soldier, that's your full-time role. But this new class of full-time warriors brings a new risk. These are people trained in violence. What's to stop them from turning that violence against their own people? Especially since in Plato's model, the rest of society has basically disarmed itself. That's where Plato introduced the idea of the guardians, also called rulers or philosopher kings. They're a class above the warriors, responsible for leading and keeping everything in balance. They're wise, disciplined, and trained not just to fight but to rule. So now we've got a three-tiered system. Producers, farmers, artisans, merchants, everyday citizens. Warriors or auxiliaries, the military class trained to protect. And guardians, the ruling elite responsible for wise and just governance. And since Plato believes each person should only do one thing they're naturally best suited for, only guardians should govern. That's why the Republic is at its core an anti-democratic work. Which kind of makes sense, right? As I mentioned earlier, Plato lived through a massive political crisis. He was trying to figure out why things went so wrong. And his answer was this: governance shouldn't be left to the crowd, because the crowd can be easily manipulated and often makes terrible decisions. Instead, leadership should be in the hands of the right people with the right values. After laying out his class system, Socrates finally defines justice. In a state, justice is when everyone sticks to their role and does what they're best suited for. Injustice, then, is when people take on responsibilities they're not equipped to handle. And when we zoom back down from society to the individual, the same logic applies. In the soul, the guardians represent reason, the warriors stand for courage or spirit, and the producers are like our animal desires: hunger, pleasure, comfort. A just person, then, is someone whose desires speak up about what they want, whose reason makes wise decisions, and whose spirit enforces those decisions, making sure we follow our head, not just our impulses. After laying out his caste system, Plato pushes things even further. He starts thinking, what if true fairness, true justice requires citizens, at least the ruling class, to let go of things like family and private property altogether? His reasoning is this: as long as people care more about their kids, their wealth and their legacy than they do about the common good, inequality will keep popping up. It's this personal attachment, he argues, that pulls society apart. Some scholars think Plato was dead serious about this model. Others think he was just trying to provoke us, to make us rethink what we believe about justice, politics and human nature. This is where things start to sound, well, dystopian. Let's zoom out for a second and talk about dystopias in general. Why do they look the way they do? Here's the thing. For most of Western history, especially before the 19th century, thinkers and writers mostly imagined ideal societies, utopias, rooted in order, harmony and moral clarity. And in that sense, Plato's Republic fits the bill. It's a full-blown utopia. It just didn't age very well, especially in light of what the 20th century had in store. But more on that later. In ancient and medieval times, the world and society were seen as basically static. The cosmos was imagined as fixed, orderly and eternal. And if the universe has a perfect design, then maybe society can too. We just need to figure out what that design looks like. That's the mindset behind early utopian classics: Plato's Republic, Augustine's City of God, and of course Thomas More's Utopia. Then came the Age of Exploration and the Enlightenment. These eras expanded people's sense of the world. It was bigger, more complex, but still the pace of change was manageable. There was room for optimism. But by the late 19th century, things changed dramatically. Industrialization and urbanization shocked the very foundations of society. Change became constant and chaotic. That's when we entered the age of dystopias. Dystopias are what happens when the utopian dream falls apart. Works like 1984, Brave New World and Fahrenheit 451 reflects growing anxiety that technology and centralized power could lead not to liberation, but to new forms of domination. And here's the twist. On the surface, the societies in those books often look like utopias. They're stable, organized, and unified, exactly the kind of harmony Plato valued. Everyone's working for the greater good. But what the 20th century taught us, loud and clear, is that society built on total control and the suppression of the individual is not a healthy society. When the so-called ideal state becomes the goal and human beings are just tools to achieve it, then that ideal stops being ideal. You may have noticed a core issue that runs through all idealized social systems, whether utopian, communist, or even the terrifying dream of Hitler's thousand-year Reich. And it's not just that they treat the individual as expendable, it's why they do. At the root of it is the belief that the world, history, and society can and should reach some perfect final form. And more than that this perfect form must be static. Perfect on paper, but dead in motion. Because history shows us something very different. Every time people have tried to lock society into a fixed version of the ideal, it clashes with something deeply human, our need for freedom, variety, and change. So we end up in a paradox. Even if humanity somehow did reach a perfect society, it couldn't stay perfect for long, because people don't thrive in stillness. The best, healthiest breakfast becomes torture if you're forced to eat it every day. In a static system, even at the peak of prosperity, people eventually stop feeling happy. Because we weren't built for perfection, we were built for adaptation. Now, if we compare those rigid utopian systems, which often start to look suspiciously like totalitarian regimes, to democracy, even with all its flaws, we see something interesting. Democracies are messy, chaotic, they're full of loopholes for populism and demagoguery, but they're also alive. Like anything living, democracies get sick, they stumble, they get dirty. And there are never any 100% guarantees. They're complicated, frustratingly slow sometimes. But here's the key difference. They can fail without collapsing completely. That's the strange contradiction of democracy. It doesn't promise a utopia, but precisely because it doesn't chase perfection, it ends up being more stable than the systems that do. Let me know what you think. Would you want to live in Plato's Republic, or are you okay with the mess of an imperfect world? And don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.